everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, it's me, Jackie.
Gotta get that out.
I just sneezed. I was trying to get my name out before I sneezed, and it didn't work.
Do you want to do it again?
No.
Okay, you just keep that in?
Keep it in.
And it's me, Diana.
Oh, wow. You might notice I'm talking quieter, everyone. I got a lot of feedback from my co-hosts about 2 seconds ago doing our sound check that I'm too loud. You know, but it's hard. I mean, when you get a job like podcaster, you think I should be loud, and sometimes you need more training, you need more support, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely need a lot of feedback, role play.
There is no training for this job.
That's a problem. With some jobs, you just don't get any training. There's not a lot of availability. I mean, you know, you got to get to the podcast, you got to get to the studio. What if there's no studio? Who's training you to do that? It can be tough. If only there was some sort of vocational training for a job like podcasting.
I think you actually can get a certificate now in podcasting.
Can you really?
Yeah, you can.
What?
Certificate?
A certificate.
All right, well, they're solving some problems in the podcast field, but sadly, there are a lot of other fields and a lot of other areas where vocational training is not apparently as advanced as podcasting is. So, tonight on this podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, we are going to discuss just that, i.e., vocational training for individuals with disabilities.
Just what?
That, the thing that I just talked about. Vocational training.
Segue.
Okay. So, we will be discussing 4 articles tonight on the subject, and those articles are...
It's my job. All right, here they come. The first one is a review of the literature on vocational training interventions with individuals with autism spectrum disorder by Campanaro, Vladescu, Manente, Deshays, and DeBar. That was very recently published in Behavioral Interventions 2021. We're also going to review a qualitative analysis of the employment needs and barriers of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in rural areas by Adams, Corbin, O'Hara, Park, Shepard-Jones, Butler, Umisigabu, McDaniels, and Bishop. That was published in the Journal of Applied Rehabilitation Counseling in 2019. Next up, JobTIPS, a transition to employment program for individuals with autism spectrum disorders by Strickland, Coles, and Southern, published in Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders 2013. And finally, Twins with Autism, Utilizing Video Feedback to Improve Job-Related Behaviors by Mackey and Nelson, published in the British Journal of Special Education 2015.
Excellent.
Big stack. Big ol' stack.
Now, a lot of our listeners are students or work with individuals in, say, like a school system, whether it's private or public school. So not as many people, I think, work with adults with disabilities who are entering the job market. And if you have little experience in that area, you might say, jobs, yikes, I'm barely making it through my job. If I didn't have to go to work, I'd love that too. But I think that's kind of a bad day at work, short-sighted viewpoint, if I may say so myself. Because when it comes down to it, even though work may not be everyone's favorite thing in the world to do, it is actually a pretty important component of everyone's quality of life. And it leads to our opportunities to engage with various social networks, and it gives us financial and personal stability, as well as a purpose and a sense of well-being. I don't know about anyone else out there, but I know when I'm feeling like I'm not getting as much done in work as I should be, whether it's my podcast work or my day job work, it does get me down. It does make me feel kind of sad. And the idea of not being able to work, I can imagine, especially given the pandemic and a lot of people being put out of work who may have never thought that would be a problem for them, really struggling with, mental and physical health problems because of it. And again, why wouldn't that be the same for an individual with or without a disability?
We titled this vocational. What is this title of this one? Vocational skills.
This was if you watch or listen to the preview episodes, you'll know this is an episode that we all were really excited to do. Yet we had so much content, we didn't really know how to pare it down.
Yeah.
So it's sort of gone through a couple names. So.
Okay, but that's not what I meant to say anyway. My point was we are titling this vocational related skills, not just job-related skills, because I feel like vocation is really a bigger category than just what maybe you do at that point in time for quote-unquote work, right? Because vocation implies that it's something that is meaningful to you, that you've had the opportunity to, spend time with it, maybe develop specialized skills with respect to it, and view it as a career. And like you were getting at, Rob, I think a lot of us, really have what we do as our vocation or our career comes to be wrapped up in our identity to some degree. And that's what brings it meaning to your life and gives you purpose, like you're talking about. And that's the piece that's really important. And I think as we have this conversation, it to me is important to kind of separate out that side of things and thinking about what it means to, contribute purposefully to something that you yourself find meaningful versus, I'm just working to pay the bills, right? Mm-hmm. Because a vocation could be something that you do to pay the bills, but it also could be something that you do that you really love and has meaning and brings identity to you as a person. So I think we can define it in that bigger way and allow us to include more opportunities for lots of people to do things that they enjoy doing and that bring meaningful identity to who they are.
And while I think we'll have various episodes, we've had episodes on sort of the profession of behavior analysis and being a behavior analyst, this is really focused more on skill barriers and skill training for individuals with disabilities, more specifically intellectual disabilities, who are about to enter the job market. Because as our research will tell us that if you wait until you are able to get a job, you may have missed some crucial opportunities to learn the skills needed to enter the job market successfully, or to at least, have those initial successes in entering the job market. It's an unfortunate fact that even though national and international bodies see promoting access to employment as a real priority for individuals with disabilities, and this is, through a lot of surveys, I know WHO, a lot of updates to U.S. law regarding more and better planning for individuals with disabilities to enter the workforce after school, individuals with disabilities still remain a group that are underemployed. Individuals with autism, often even more so. The employment rate when we're looking at Americans without disabilities is, as of some of the articles we're discussing, so, about 2020, 2021, it's about 75%. I know we've had a lot of, global upheaval recently that might have changed those numbers around. But when you're looking at employment rates for Americans with a disability, that number drops to 34 to 39% of individuals. And then when you add in intellectual disabilities, then it's even lower, 18 to 23% of people. And that's in, metropolitan areas with access to service. And as we're going to talk about tonight, the farther you go into, say, more isolated or rural environments, that number continues to drop. So this is definitely a concern. And it's not one that is, if we only had the right TA, I'm sure everyone would have a job. There are a lot of issues involved. Yeah. And we're going to go over a number of barriers as well as a number of skill kind of training and acquisition, research, programs and proposals that are out there tonight. So we're going to cover kind of a wide swath of topics related to, this overall theme of tonight's episode.
So I think, like you said, Rob, a lot of these studies kind of point to the same factors here. I would say that young autistic adults have some of the lowest employment rates out of any disability category. And we know that that's not necessarily being able to learn the skills, right? But potentially lack of opportunity therein. And like you said, some other barriers that we'll discuss. And then of those that are employed, about 50% work in segregated vocational settings. So there may be, limitations there on what type of work's really available to them. What the research that has been done on vocational training has identified that individuals who've received that training have the highest employment rates of those groups. So the training can be effective at teaching necessary skills in order to participate in the job setting, and likely having ongoing support in those environments is going to lead to more successful employment over time. And, in the same vein, coming into the job setting with a higher sort of set of social skills or more sophisticated social skills will also assist in obtaining and maintaining employment, according to the research that's out there so far. Mm-hmm. So all of that makes sense. And, what I liked about these studies is that they a lot of them didn't just focus on like the end result skill that said, oh, for this particular type of job, you need to know how to, wash the dishes and bust the table, etc. Because there's so many other factors that go into being prepared to be in that type of work setting and participating fully within that environment in such a way that you can, understand the rules of the job and getting along with peers, etc. So there's a lot of pieces there that are really needed to acquire and then maintain those job skills that we're going to take into consideration. So there's, pieces here that may be more reflective of what could be better done on an individual level, and then pieces here that are going to be reflective of what could be better done on a societal level for sure.
And I think that when I was reading some of the articles, I really was, when they were focusing on like nonverbal language, right? Like nonverbal cues, I was like, I don't think you necessarily have to teach that. I think you have to train the people in the workforce to then, right, be like, this is okay. This person doesn't have to look at you. If they look at you, great. If they don't, also great. Like that doesn't matter that much. So I think a lot of the times they're focusing on things that we might be better suited to focus on a training on compassion and empathy and diversity and neurodivergence, right, in the workforce, so that it's a more accepting society, right, and it's a more accepting workforce for the incoming neurodivergent population. So a lot of the times when I'm reading it, I was like, I don't think that they should be doing this here, right, because a lot of the times, like for instance with job interviewing, right, that doesn't tell you if you're a good interviewer, that doesn't mean you're going to be good at your job, right? And likewise,
and vice versa, yeah.
So, I mean, those types of things that's why we always have done it, right? In the quotation marks. That doesn't mean that's how we have to do it, right?
It's challenging. I mean, I think when we talk about barriers, when we talk about preparing individuals to enter the workforce, we're sort of kind of trying to do two things at once. Number one is we're trying to prepare them with skills that are going to be considered socially valid by the individuals who have the power that can hire them, while at the same time understanding that many of those viewpoints of sort of the prospective employer might be, considered outdated or overly biased towards the neurotypical individual, and not necessarily in a way that is, well, it has to be this way because. A lot of times you find you say it has to be this way because your answer is, actually, I don't know why. It probably could be different, right? And it's a real challenge there. I think that's one of the other challenges is it would be great to say, well, this individual is the individual they are, and here's how they're going to function in the greater world, and here's how they can function with the job that they're choosing, and here are some ways that society should definitely improve themselves. And while we want to be pushing for that, if we don't plan for the eventuality that some places will not be that accepting, no, eye contact is very important in my old odd firm,
right,
then we potentially are limiting the employment pool for the client. So it's really that kind of back and forth and really planning for a future, but still having to be mindful of a present that isn't quite where I think anyone really wants it to be in terms of acceptance and in terms of being able to accommodate and modify for individuals in ways that are not going to impact an end product of whatever the business or whatever the job is selling, whatever the product happens to be.
How much I think you need those varied social skills is going to depend on the job, right? But there are certainly some sectors where collaboration and cooperation are really key skills to develop, and it's not every job that's a requirement. So it also may depend on what are the strengths of the individual and what type of employment they'd like to have as far as how you might focus on those things.
All right. Well, let's get into some of the
that
research.
Wraps it up.
No, we haven't time for the research. Let's start by continuing on kind of with a conversation about some of the barriers. And so Adams and colleagues did a 2017 needs assessment in their paper. So one of the reasons that I thought this would be kind of a good, not exactly a microcosm, because it is a very specific needs assessment of a rural area, specifically Kentucky, good old Kentucky here in the United States. But it is looking at an area that is, again, no offense, Kentucky. These are all things that are in the paper. I've never been there. Your fried chicken is amazing.
I actually really like Kentucky.
What do they have there? I don't actually know. I do like bluegrass.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I've never been there. They have Blue Hills, right? Is that Kentucky?
So beautiful.
Okay. But again, I'm not, these are statements from the article referring
Every time you
to
say rural, I think of the rural.
The rural.
Yes. Funny. I know that one.
Nice.
But looking at kind of Kentucky as a very rural area and very rural
Sorry.
as the categories go.
Yeah.
So when you talk about barriers in an area like Kentucky, you may not be talking about barriers that will generalize to every area, certainly not to some metropolitan areas. But if we think about it as, and I don't say this to disparage Kentucky, but kind of a least common denominator in terms of like, these are big barriers that need to be overcome, then I think it does give us a sense of, all right, well, if it's, not exactly exponentially, but if it's much more impactful, some of these barriers in that setting, it's probably still impactful in other settings as well. And we could start there, to look at how does it compare in their setting, some of these barriers, or how people have responded to these barriers. So like we said at the top, rural areas often are going to already have kind of poor economic conditions, meaning fewer jobs, meaning less public transportation, meaning fewer social services, or at least a greater distance to receive those social services. As well as, this is a quote, because I don't want to be accused of just making general statements about Kentucky, but a quote, cultural reluctance to seek or accept help, end quote. So that, may impact the ability of individuals with disabilities to gain access to training or to services, or, as will come up a bunch of times, transportation. There also seem to be higher prevalence rates of individuals with disabilities in the poor rural counties. So like 20% in poor rural counties versus 13.7% in urban counties. There'll also be lower employment rates potentially for all individuals, which then impact the employment rates for individuals with disabilities. So in Kentucky, 85% of the counties that were surveyed are rural or very rural. That really great technical term, very rural. They have a higher poverty rate in comparison to a lot of other U.S. states. They're geographically isolated in a lot of ways. And in a 2014 survey, only 18.1% of individuals with intellectual disabilities had employment versus 26.8% who had employment with some other type of disability. Again, a lot of the individuals in Kentucky with disabilities also are much more likely to just be attending a day program or a workshop versus, say, what might be considered meaningful employment, less opportunities, or less individuals who are engaged in volunteer work or in classes or training to get a better job. So that only 7%, for example, that's 7% of individuals with disabilities versus 21% nationally who are at least in some sort of a job training position. So this is a survey result. So again, we got our good old Likert scale of 1 to 5. So these are people's opinions. Which people's? Well, 457 Kentucky adults.
I was thinking you're like, oh, they surveyed 100 people on the street, and he's the top 5 answers.
Show me lack of public transportation.
Kentuckians.
It was mostly female, about half individuals in their 40s to 40 to 59. No, I thought that was important. I thought that was a kind of skewed a lot older. Dinah's giving me the don't need any more statistics, but I thought the skewing a little older. I'm not going to do all the percentages. I have to share all of
my percentages in just a minute.
I'm not going to do all the percentages. I don't want our
audience to be just percentaged out.
I'm not sharing any percentages.
That's good. I just thought that the 49 to 59 age group seemed higher for the group, which
those are the people who are walking around the street.
I don't believe it was just people on the street. They reached out to individuals in a very specific way. That was the joke answer there.
Oh, sorry.
And 69% of the respondents were from rural communities. Now, here's a statistic that I think is important, is that 58% of the people surveyed self-identified, and it was all self-identification, as service providers, which again might give us different responses than, say, the 37% of individuals who are family members or caregivers. And unfortunately, only 5% identified or self-identified as self-advocates, which again, I think is a bit of a problem because we would like to see a higher percentage of individuals with the disabilities sharing their thoughts on employment. However, depending on the way the survey is presented, it may be difficult due to the intellectual disability, to feel that those are going to be valid results due to maybe communication difficulties. So I guess it makes sense, but it is always sad when you see that number be that low. So the questions were on, like I said, a Likert scale and went across 10 life areas, including employment, their education and early intervention history, childcare access, advocacy access to housing, transportation, community supports, health and wellness, healthcare, and housing. And then they sort of looked at like the 3 broad categories that came from those 10 subcategories to sort of put together what they referred to as inductive thematic analysis Sounds very fancy way to group the comments into more understandable themes. So we'll start with the self-advocates group. The results were relatively similar across 3 groups. I'm not going to spend forever on them, but I'll give a little bit more time to the self-advocate group. So in terms of looking at what was the degree for needs of activities supporting paid employment, that scored very high or very high, so like 4.29 out of 5, with employment being one of the top 3 areas considered for need. Some of the themes that came out in results related to there's a scarcity of employment opportunities in these areas, challenges with transportation costs and being able to access transportation. This part was so sad. Low expectations from employers, or just a flat out unwillingness to hire individuals with disabilities, questioning needs for more trainings. And also, and this is something I've never thought of, and it's going to be very important for individuals, especially in rural or areas with higher rates of poverty. How does employment affect one's benefits? Because that does become a real concern. If you are able to make too much money, you lose your benefits.
Yes.
But you might not be able to make enough money to then have a sustainable wage without those same benefits, especially when it comes to healthcare. So again, training individuals and training employers on what does that mean? It's very sad.
For most people, it means that they can, remain below that minimum threshold of salary so they can maintain their benefits. But that in and of itself limits so many employment opportunities for them, because they could only work part-time, less than part-time, in a job that probably isn't paying a lot.
Yeah. I did appreciate how this article put together some of the summaries of what individuals said. So I just want to read a couple of the ones that I thought really stood out to me. So, one individual said that it's just hard to find things to do. Another one said there are no support services even after they are hired. The other, another one said being realized and accepted for the public as well as fellow workers to be educated in abilities and knowledge that a person with a developmental disability may still have for a really good employer, the ability to find that little job that someone may do that usually isn't really paid attention to. And, I'm going to skim over family members, caregivers, and service providers. Again, the degree of need dropped a little bit from each group in terms of, need for more employment services, but a lot of the same themes were the same. Employment was still either in the top 3 or top 5 for both of those groups. A lot of the same themes. Again, we need businesses that are willing to work with supported employment centers, was one thing a family member or caregiver said. The service providers, there are positive effects from the individuals up to the community, but, feeling like that was falling on deaf ears in some ways. Again, the authors talk about transportation again as a significant and persistent problem for a lot of individuals with disabilities, especially in rural areas. They say, potentially twice as hard in a rural area, which is a good swath of even here in America.
I was surprised that you said that there was a higher percentage of the population in a rural area with a disability than in an urban area because of that disparity in access to transportation. I would have thought it was reverse.
Yeah, I was surprised too. I wasn't sure if it had more to do with just the population as a whole, just the numbers sort of working out that way. I don't know. I'm just the citation from this article. Again, another challenge are a lot of the jobs that were available are limited to entry level or service jobs or cleaning positions. Which again, that part was pretty consistent with what we see nationally for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Which I appreciate, and we'll talk about your article in a little bit, Tanner, the Campanaro article, that looking at categories other than service, cleaning, wait staff, jobs that might be more enticing to a lot of individuals. Because I'm sure not everyone says, I really love being a service employee. Some people definitely do like that job, which is great because everyone has a preference. But that does seem to be sort of overrepresented in the sample here. So that kind of leaves us, well, these are some of the challenges that are probably going to be faced everywhere, not just in Kentucky. And from that, we need to think, all right, what is there to solve the problem? But before we talk about that, why don't we take a little break? And then when we come back, let's get into what the research tells us about improving some of those outcomes. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking about vocational training. But before we continue our discussion of the research, I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. Huzzah! All you need to do is go to the website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus, that's GET-CEUS, and enter in one of the 2 secret code words we've put in the episode. And the first one is outdoors, OUTDOORS. It's easy to remember. Just think of everyone's favorite Dan Aykroyd, John Candy movie, The Great Outdoors.
I love that movie.
Right? He's got to eat that big steak, and he's got to eat all the fat in the gristle. Oh, hilarious. Good times.
And the bear.
Oh, and the big bear. Yep. Man, John Candy, what a treasure. Sorry, you listeners who don't remember John Candy. Outdoors, though, is the code word.
So the article that I had was a review of the literature on vocational training interventions.
I wish it was a review of a review.
It almost was.
Okay. Those are my favorite when it's like, I'm going to review this one review.
I'm going to review the reviews. There were previous reviews. So this was not the first group that took on this challenge, but it was really important that they did because there's so much literature out there. And it was really helpful to read it in this fashion and have it all bend into all the different which ways that you might want to think about what has actually been done thus far in attempting to teach vocational skills, which is obviously a really huge area. So in the beginning of this article, they provide us with some similar stats as Rob gave us previously. In the US, they said about 70% of all adults are employed, but only 10 to 50% of people with an ASD are employed. It's obviously a big range. It's because it's coming from, multiple different sets of statistics. And then they said only 14% of those who are more severely impacted by their diagnosis are employed. And that was from an article by Nicholas and colleagues in 2015. Then they also noted as well that for folks who are employed, they are often in more lower skilled jobs and they make less money than their non-disabled peers. So we would like to see more employment opportunities for folks and, more careful consideration of what people would actually prefer to be doing and, creatively thinking about how we can ensure that they have access to many different types of jobs. And they said that, we can make this whole situation better by better preparing people to be in a job-related world. School, and this is true for everyone, right, does not really prepare you for the world of employment.
Not even a little bit.
Right. They said we could be doing a better job of that for everyone, but certainly for individuals with disabilities. Wayman and colleagues did a personalized vocational assessment that was a useful tool for them that they identified. They also said that internships and leaving high school with a resume were also factors that influence future employment. So those might be things that we should be considering. And even though we know vocational training is important, there's not a lot of evidence out there that quality vocational training programs really exist. And there's not a ton of research on how to best teach vocational skills. So that's really what they were trying to amass together here. They said that this is not the first review of vocational teaching strategies, but they expanded it to include a broader age range and more detail. So in your face, previous lit reviews.
We got it.
They're like, how is ours different? They were extremely thorough. So they did a search for all this variety of words related to this topic, including autism, employment, vocational, instructional, training, teaching, transitions, adults, high schools, and middle schools. And they ended up with over 1,000 studies. And then from there, they narrowed it down by checking to make sure that at least 50% of the participants included in the study were autistic, that the studies were experimental, that they were peer-reviewed, that they had individual data to present. And once they did all of that, they had whittled it down to 50 papers instead. And then they broke it down and said, okay, what are the different dependent variables in these studies, right? So what are all these different studies measuring? And then what are the independent variables in these studies? How did they work to try to make a change in the vocational skills that they were teaching? So the types of things that they were measuring fit into several categories, which included pre-vocational skills. They considered these prerequisite skills needed for employment, such as interview skills, job-related skills, problem-solving skills, comprehension of job-related written materials, and computer skills. I feel like this is a really important area, right, that we don't talk enough about, because these are skills that are, to me, like cusp skills, right? Like you should have these in order to then access a variety of different employment settings. And while we may work on some of those, we don't necessarily look to see if we have generalization to these variety of settings with these types of skills. So it's really critically important in my mind. Some studies looked at clerical skills, things like making copies, stuffing envelopes, sorting mail, custodial skills like emptying the garbage, cleaning tables, food service skills like food prep and serving coffee, retail skills such as customer service skills, inventory management, VCR repair,
Child daycare, computer programming,
bookkeeping, and gun repair. Entertainment. This one is in here solely because that whole series of studies about the mascot, like wearing the mascot costume.
The fire safety mascot.
Yes.
That was like, we did that. We did that one.
The researcher's name is Alan. There's 3 or 4 of those. So those researchers had these mascot costumes and they're like, what are we going to do with these mascot costumes? I assume is how that started. But there's some
episode 8, we talked about one of those. I thought we talked about one of those studies.
Episode 8 is toilet training, so probably not.
Okay.
Those are some of the best vocational studies. Actually, I read a different review before and it listed those as some of the best designed studies, in fact. But that category's only thing in that category is those mascot studies. The human services arena, so teaching and working with others, such as behavior techs, agriculture, like gardening or beekeeping, and then finally management, supervising other staff members. So there is, a range of things that were taught using vocational training. And then the ways that they taught those skills were, again, in several categories, including video modeling, video prompting, behavior skills training, feedback, reinforcement, computer-based instruction, and then intervention packages that combined those things together. They checked to see if the studies included any social validity measures, and then they measured the outcome of the studies at the study level for positive, mixed, or negative outcome, and then also at the individual level. Basically, these were determined by did all or some of the participants master all or some of their target skills. And they got IOA on that, and they did a good job. And then there was a 5-page long table where they summarized all of these 50 studies. But luckily, you don't have to read that unless you just really want to go and get into that in detail, because I have summarized it here for you. So, in summary, these dependent variables, most of the studies just looked at one single vocational task. 34% of them looked at clerical tasks, 19% looked at vocational tasks, 13% looked at custodial tasks, and then the rest of them went down the list from there.
There's all the percentages again.
I know.
Good.
Sorry, I just had to do it. But as you can see, a lot of these were, fairly easily taught single skills, right? So we weren't talking about that big picture, how do we cooperate with one another and, brainstorm. It was things that were probably a lot easier to teach, honestly. And then for the interventions, the independent variables, about half had a single intervention and half used a package intervention. When they did use the packages, the most common interventions, either alone or package, were video modeling, feedback, BST, and video prompting. A lot of the studies took advantage of technology. So 64% used tablets or iPhones to teach it. And a couple of them used computers. One used a two-way radio. That was one of the mascot studies again.
I feel like the two-way radio is a very underutilized technology, especially when you think about something like two-way radio.
Walkie-talkie?
Yeah, but I would think like a phone with a Bluetooth headpiece would be considered. Not exactly a two-way radio, but it's just a way to communicate between two people who are not in the exact same spot.
Like a telephone.
Yeah, but nobody uses those anymore.
Right. I'm so sorry. How embarrassing. A few of them looked at generalization of these skills. Some of them looked at maintenance of these skills, but not everybody. About 60% actually included a social validity measure, which I thought was pretty good. Mm-hmm. And of the ones that did, 87% of the social validity measures that they gathered were positive. Okay? So by and large, the vocational training that was conducted produced the results that they were looking for.
That's always nice.
8% of the studies had overall positive, 11% had mixed. And then at the individual level, 78% of the individuals in the studies met their goals, all of their goals, and 22% did not. What they want us to take away from this, in addition to the fact that we could teach a whole variety of skills using these types of trainings, and that BST, right, is right there at the top, as is video prompting, is that the vocational interventions that occurred in natural settings had more positive outcomes than those that were taught in a clinical setting, which makes perfect sense when we think about the generalization component here. And when it was a package intervention, that almost always had a positive outcome. So we have all these tools that we know work really readily. We should be applying them as intervention packages to tackle this situation. When the results were mixed, the most common occurrence there was using video modeling as the sole intervention without additional prompting or reinforcement or BST with it. So that might be something to consider avoiding. And
Well, it's a 50-50 shot. If you just use video modeling, maybe it'll work.
okay, yeah.
I'm going to be optimistic.
Right. Well, we'd have to look at the stats on that because there's a different way to interpret that outcome. Okay. And then the thing that they wanted to take away, and this is super duper important, so tune back in. Only 4% of these studies looked at what happened after they did the study, right? Were the individuals better prepared to actually participate in their employment setting? And or did they then go out and get a new employment opportunity following the training? Only 4% looked at that. And when 4% is like very few studies, right? So I can report that half of them in the 4% were able to get a new job after training, but it's such a minuscule number that we don't know enough about whether what they did was really effective to go on. So that's what we need to know, right? Is how do we teach people not how to do like clean the table task, but how do we teach them the overarching skills that they need in order to be successful in whatever type of job is meaningful for them.
Or what percentage of knowing how to engage in a few of the skills related to a job, or what we think of as like the key components of that job, actually resulting in either meaningful employment or maintenance of that employment. What are the soft skills that are missing?
Mm-hmm. They also noted that these studies really, by and large, did not include any type of vocational choice for the participants. So they were just said, oh, guess what? Today you're bussing tables. And there wasn't, at least as far as we know, the choice component built in. That is equally important piece that needs to be included moving forward, because the opportunity to find a vocation that you like to do and that brings you joy and pride should be part of our human rights.
And actually, some of the articles that we sort of had on our short list to possibly include did focus on the higher percentage of acceptance of employment sites and lower rates of, say, like challenging behavior or interfering behavior when individuals were allowed to choose the activity of their job rather than here's your job, now you will do it. So, again, not getting too much into that, but choice is also important for, maintaining appropriate behavior. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I were told now your job is something that I hated, I probably would just not show up to work.
And you have the option to do that.
Yes, and I have the option to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Because I got my podcast certificate, so I can always fall back on that sometime.
Everything's coming up, Rob.
Yeah. All right. So thanks, Diana. And thanks, Compinar and colleagues, for summarizing that so we could do a summary of your summary.
It was a very well-written article.
It was very good. Now, one of the things that we sort of talked about was that it's not just about being able to do a job, but about how does one prepare to even enter the workforce. So, Jackie...
You just took my thunder. I had a whole segue.
Sorry. Well, I was segging to you. You can continue the segue.
I'm not going to continue what I was just going to say.
Sorry.
But yes, that was my introduction. The first hurdle is getting a job is the job interview, right? So a lot of the times, like I said before, when you have your job interview, It relies a lot on social cues and nonverbal body language, which is not what it really should be about, right? If the job is not a very social job, right? So like I always joke I'm watching a show right now from the early 2000s called The IT Crowd.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
I've seen it, so good.
The British one.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
Super funny.
It is fun.
And right, so they're talking about, at one point they're interviewing, they're like, I interviewed horribly, but I know everything about this computer.
Mhm.
Right? So it's rarely that the two go hand in hand. So the authors suggested that maybe teaching verbal and nonverbal skills would be important because there's an interviewing component, even though it may not correspond to how well you do your job. But within those teaching skills, there should be a rationale as to why these skills are important, both verbally and nonverbally, because they cited a lack of theory of mind a lot of the times with autistic individuals, so they might not recognize what the interviewer is putting down, right? So they said, yeah, we need to teach that. The best way to teach it, we know, is through direct instruction of social skills needed within the job interview. They didn't call it BST, but it was BST. They're like, instructions, modeling, role play, feedback. It was so funny. I was like, yep, that's BST. And then they talk about how using technology may also be helpful, right? So they cited some literature on video modeling, but what they were really focusing on is virtual reality. So having a safe place to practice interviewing skills through the use of an avatar in a learning environment in its virtual place.
When I was reading this article, I was just sort of thinking about some of the other researchers that we've, talked to about their work in virtual reality. And that was, like 2-3 years ago. And I'm like, oh, these poor kids being submitted to 2011 or 2012 virtual reality. I mean, they must have been like throwing up and how terrible it was. Now I turn my head and it takes 2 seconds for the computer to figure out where I am.
Your polygon interviewer.
Oh, yeah.
No, it actually looks pretty good. So at the end of the manuscript, they do show what the virtual learning environment looks like. It looks pretty fine.
Mhm.
I mean, right? You can see the person, like the little interviewer, right? So the interviewer is
They look like the Minecraft guy.
the interviewer. It does look like a Minecraft guy. So but the great thing is the interview is also an avatar to one of the researchers or the clinicians that's acting within there, right? So they're speaking over headsets and stuff. So it's not like
it's not all text based. You got to type in your answers,
right?
like Zork,
Yeah. So they said that
you approach an interviewer.
they talked about how this might be a learning environment that could teach skills, but we don't know if these skills will actually transfer to the actual interview. So the purpose of the study was to examine the use of a web-based interviewing skills program called JobTIPS, which still exists, just so you know. You can go and get a demo of it for free. I looked it up. It was pretty fun. And then additionally, with this JobTIPS program, they also had this virtual reality practice. So this is not a single subject design. Spoiler. They had 22 autistic individuals. They categorized them as having Asperger's or high-functioning autism, but they don't really tell us why or how. So I'm just putting that out there. They had to have access to a computer and be able to use it and not have any impairment that would prevent them from the use of virtual reality. And they shouldn't have seen the JobTIPS website. The JobTIPS website does look like it was made in 2010.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When I clicked on it, I was like, oh, it's like for a student. It's like fluorescent.
In reading the article, it felt very ahead of its time in a lot of ways.
Did.
So I mean, I didn't get to the site itself, but just it felt like a lot of techniques. Like, well, these should still be very easy to do.
Yeah, it did seem. I mean, I didn't go through the demo because I have already so many emails of demo things that I'm like, you will love this. So, and I don't have use for it in my real life, but it is a web-based application that covers 5 domains, such as career interests. That includes a quiz, which is nice.
Yeah, I like
right?
that.
Mhm.
Finding how to find a job, how to get a job, how to keep a job, and then other job-related interests. And it includes step-by-step instructions in each of these domains, icons to increase comprehension, embedded video models, quizzes, scripts, and worksheets that you can print out.
Well, we know if only the video models were there, it would be 50-50, if it were successful.
That's right.
So I bet it's higher than 50-50 because they got all that other stuff, quizzes and, different visuals.
Package.
Yeah.
So that is the package. That's the intervention package that they used. They also collaborated with an HR representative to come up with a measure on how they were going to rate the individuals during the simulated interviews that they had. So not when they're in the virtual reality or not when they're in the JobTIPS, but when they're doing their practice interviews. And so they included behavioral interview questions, situational interview questions, nonverbal social skills, and included in that expectations and rationales for why those are there. So they included things like interview overview, think like the interviewer, respond like a star.
But my favorite.
They put STAR, but then they don't tell you what STAR is anywhere in the paper. I was looking like, what is that? I don't know. It must be in the JobTIPS program. Rehearsing responses to questions, greeting and handshakes during the interview, and what happens at the end of the interview. So those are the kind of things that they were looking at. And during these sections, they included caption videos showing what an appropriate response during an interview might look like, quizzes, summaries, worksheets, scripts, all those things, right? And so the HR people made 2 rating scales, which were the DVs. The response content rating scale, where they rated 1 to 4 on a variety of things, the content of the questions, and response delivery rating scale. So how well they delivered their things. Again, it was 1 to 4. And then it's looking at readings in verbals, eye contact, how they engage, sat, how they, I guess, looked when they were giving the questions. So the participants were randomly divided into a control and treatment group. Both groups participated in 2 simulated job interviews. So this is likely a pre-test, post-test, right? Mm-hmm. The control group or the contrast group did nothing. They just did these 2 interviews.
Right.
Which I kind of feel bad a little bit. I wish they would have been and then the control group got access to the JobTIPS program afterwards because it was mildly effective, but they don't say that.
Well, they at least got to play in a virtual reality job simulation. Which,
not the contrast. They didn't get to do that.
I thought they did the...
No.
Oh, they just did the regular interview.
They just had to come to a fake interview, which is the worst.
I forgot that wasn't the same.
No. So, they get nothing. So I'm hoping they got something. 24 hours before the
2010 virtual reality headset, their very own to get sick using. 24
hours before each of the interviews, they were given a job description of a pretend job. So it was a stock clerk position and talked about all the job responsibilities and what you would need to do. The interviews occurred with the HR representative. They were blind to which group the participants were in, and they conducted the interview where it could be recorded and observed. They included 5 standard interview questions like, tell me about yourself, those types of things, and 5 situational interview questions. Yeah. So during the interview, the HR completed the rating scales and was told to remain neutral to all of the responses, whether positive or not. So they had 44 interview simulations where they were videotaped, and they used those to identify areas of need. And also they had 4 separate raters rate the interviews. So they had some HR reps, they had an autism interventionist, they had some clinicians, they had other people do it. So the second interview occurred at least 7 days after the initial interview. There you go. So the treatment group received the JobTIPS website. So they got a username, password, a whole binder with everything printed out, which is so nice. I would have loved to get that. I love it when people give me binders of things. And all of the materials, right?
More fuel for the fire.
I know, right? And they did track their usage history to make sure that they completed the entire program.
Well, that's good. I feel like so many studies, they have, we have this great website. We don't know if anyone used it, but then here are the results.
Yeah, so they did track that everyone completed it. And at the end, they had to complete a form with questions in order to finish the program. But they didn't mention if they had to, do well on the questions.
Oh, 80% or, yeah.
Right, they didn't tell me, a percentage or anything. So once they finished the JobTIPS program, then they did 1 session, 30-minute virtual reality practice, which doesn't also seem that many. 1 person's not that much.
Yeah.
So 1 clinician served as an avatar interviewer. The participant was their own avatar. And they communicated via speakers and headphones. And in this place, right, the clinician avatar praised appropriate responses, highlighted the strengths of the interview, right, and then provided explicit feedback on those less desirable responses. And then they kept practicing again until I'm assuming that it looked good.
Yeah.
Right? The one caveat here, right, is that because they were avatars, they couldn't pick up on what it looked like.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this is one limitation we'll talk about in a little bit, right? Because when they did the ratings on the response content, response delivery, and they also looked at a social responsiveness scale to see did their autistic deficits improve. The answer is no.
Yeah. I'm also trying to think, I didn't see the picture, but how much body language, facial expression are you going to get from an avatar?
None. That's
at
the
that
problem.
component? Because I'm thinking,
right, there's none.
what was out? PlayStation 3. I mean, you can do like fancy facial expressions. You can get
But there
Andy
was
Serkis to,
Yeah.
mocap your interview, but I'm pretty sure he was outside of the JobTIPS price range, That's the deluxe model.
Right. Yeah, no, nothing. And that was the biggest limitation, is that they could teach them what to say, but how to say it and how they reacted in the actual interview, they couldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no significant differences in the demographic information for all the participants, right? They saw pretty high correlations between all 4 raters. And so they provided a summary score for each pre and post-test interview scale. And the content rating scale ranged from 10 to 20, and the delivery ranged from 20 to 80. And what they found is JobTIPS worked like they thought it would, right? That's great.
Mhm.
It was good at teaching content. So they saw from pre to post responses improved, right? Which would make sense because you're practicing in that specific virtual environment and through the JobTIPS program, but not so much for the delivery. So that was much lower, although it was higher than the control, but right. And what I'm thinking is, does that matter? That's what I kept reading about it. Like, should there be, if the response content is there, but the delivery is not great, right? Maybe we train our interviewers and our business people, right, that we work with, that stuff doesn't matter and it's okay, right? Like, I don't need to shake your hand. It's during a pandemic right now. If someone shakes my hand,
we don't do that anymore.
We don't do that anymore. Like, I don't need to look at you. I can orient my body to you. Like, there's other ways that we can be responsive. So I was like, I don't actually care that the delivery was not as great because I don't think it matters as much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and so much research I think we've looked at points to the individuals who are doing hiring often are hiring for reasons of like, they seemed trustworthy or I thought they could do the job. And it's not particularly successful in terms of finding the best employees. A lot of the reasons, hirers will give for, well, this is why I hired the person, like, don't really lead to always, like the high percentage of sort of like quality hires that you would sort of want to have. So I think there is something, to be said for that, Jackie, of like, is it even so much we need to train hirers that those skills aren't important so much as, well, what actually is important? Like, how should people hire?
Yeah.
Because they might find it's a little bit of that, but it's a lot more of skill X, Y, or Z rather than, I think, most hiring, which is, that sounded good to me and they seemed fine to me.
In one of my classes, I show a video of a Canadian company that does this like day-long alternative kind of interview process with folks that they're looking to add to their team who are, sort of creatively and engineering minded, but may not present well in the traditional sense in an interview. And so it's a very hands-on type of process where they have everyone come in, they give them like different like Lego tasks to do and have them approach like different problem solving strategies and looking at how they, can sort of creatively adapt to the engineering problems that they need to solve. And with the understanding that an interview, while they might do one, isn't the most important part for them to actually determine if this is going to be someone that can do the job that they need to do. And like, that shouldn't be so revolutionary, but it really is.
Yeah.
What do I want you to do day to day? Can you do that super well? Great. I'll figure out any other skills that we determine along the way.
Yeah.
Whereas, I'm interviewing for front of house. Well, you probably are going to have good eye contact. You're going to have to smile and, read people's facial expressions really well because that's
part of your
what
job.
the job is, right?
But it might not be.
But it might not be. No,
Right.
but I'm, working as, maybe even a waiter. You might not need that. I mean, I've had
You don't.
waiters who are just, really good and fast and are friendly and say
And
something nice
remember
to me
things.
and they remember what I ordered. And I don't care that they weren't like, let me take a look at you and stare at you for a while and like, hey, like I'm thinking of
Have you ever had them sit down in the booth with you?
Yes.
ooh, no.
Or touch me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you like that?
Nope.
Wow, even Jackie does not like
creepy
that.
I don't.
restaurant are you going to where the
I
waiter
actually
is
kinda
sitting
liked
with
it
you?
when
I
it happened to
don't.
me.
Ugh.
I only like it never.
Yeah.
So, but that's beside the point.
Okay, sorry.
There is another study that we're going to talk about that also uses technology.
You didn't steal my segue, Jackie. I didn't have a great one for this one.
I tried.
I'm going to bring it back around, and I'm going to get a little bit more into possibly some of the video modeling, though I don't know if this is exactly what Campanaro and colleagues were looking for in terms of a quality study. Let's just say this one didn't make the 5-page list from the overall summary analysis.
Interesting, right? I wonder why.
I don't know if it was the best study. It was one that I've had for a long time. And I really wanted to, I thought it was a good kind of capture of like, well, this is one way that you could do some job training. But I think it had been a while since I read it, because reading it again, there were definitely some limitations to the methodology.
Talk about it for 5 minutes.
5 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
But don't you want to know about these twins with autism, which is the title of the article?
That makes no sense. I'm so sorry. I don't want to like rag on this article, but
I do, and I will.
Why is that the lead?
I would think it would be
can't
utilizing.
Imagine it's pertinent.
Yeah, utilizing video feedback to improve job-related behaviors of twins with autism, perhaps, would be the better title. You're kind of burying the lead there.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, twins with autism, tell me more. I don't know what this will. So in this study, we have 2, again, autistic twins who have had previous experience with video feedback, 2 twins. And really, this was a goal to say, can we improve specifically job-related behaviors? So a positive here. This is a study that did work with the individuals at their job sites. And not just one job site, but 3 job sites. So that is a positive. They really wanted to say, well, what would happen if we use some sort of video feedback in training job-related behaviors? So we have our 2 19-year-old siblings. They're in a transition program school. They have cognitive functioning scoring in the low range and adaptive skills scoring in the low range, according to like the Weschler and the Vineland scores. There was Jack, who had been reported as having kind of low work stamina, difficulty managing frustrating situations, often would talk in a loud volume, engaged in some compulsive behaviors like not washing his hands, picking his skin, could be rigid around task completion. And his brother, John, who, again, some of those similar kind of interfering behaviors, as well as needing more support to socialize with other individuals, which, again, depending on your job, you may not need to do that much, right? And some sensory issues. So, positive, again, of the article, 3 different vocational sites for the individuals were used in this training. And that's because, as part of their program, they had 3 experiential employment sites they went to. There was a job coach that worked with them 1-to-1 or 1-to-2, and the sites came from an interest inventory done by both of the siblings, which was great. They'd work for 4 hours 3 times a week, and they get a lunch break in between. Jack worked at a nonprofit food bank, an organization that sold refurbished adaptive equipment. So it was kind of like a big warehouse setting. And then another job site where he packaged food and cleaned equipment. John similarly worked at an organization that refurbished computers. He had a job where he input data. Actually, he input data at that job. Sorry. He worked at the education office of a local theater where he would kind of label books for some of the classes that they offered there. And he also had jobs where he would file paperwork and fold programs. So kind of a wide range of job responsibilities and tasks, which was great. So each of the jobs had kind of 5 behaviors that were considered to have the most significant impact on an individual's ability to work effectively in those environments. These were based on normative data collected by on-site workers. So already I know there are some of the skills that we might say, like, is that really that important? So again, maybe not, but people who were working those jobs said these are the most important parts of these jobs. So again, it was the people who were going to be doing the hiring or doing the long-term supporting. So it is somewhat important that their feedback comes into play here. And those included things like active engagement, which was just defined as productive action directly related to an assigned task. Application of decision-making skills, which is the ability to accurately typo, I put sick in my notes, identify a problem, find an appropriate solution, and apply the solution. Appropriate interaction with others, so greeting and responding to others, appropriate verbalizations when you pass someone by, making a request appropriately if someone is busy, responding appropriately when given directions, proper hygiene, keeping your fingers out of your mouth and nose, and washing hands after picking, coughing, or sneezing, and smooth transition, maintain productivity when shifting from task to task, stopping work to take assigned breaks, or ending a work shift in a timely manner with a positive attitude. Which I always say, like, well, if they want to work through a break, that sounds great. But a lot of times legally, you are mandated to take those breaks. So refusing to take one becomes a liability. So in baseline, the job coach that worked with both twins just sort of observed the participants at these random 15-minute periods at these kind of like 1-minute intervals who do would do partial interval recording, whether the behaviors of note occurred, so were they actively engaged was kind of the one positive. They were doing job-related tasks, or were they engaging in inappropriate job-related behaviors for those other 4 areas? So that was the baseline. And then the verbal feedback and job coach evaluation was pretty similar. There was just a camera set up, and the individuals were filmed for 15 minutes at a random time. Then after they got back to the program, so after the workday, the participants, so one of the brothers would sit down with the coach and watch the video. The coach would complete the BOSS, the behavioral observation of students in schools form, which was pretty much the same thing where they'd have these like interval observations on whether they, followed the job expectations, engaged in some of those other like off-task or inappropriate behaviors, and then didn't really do anything with that result. They just took the data next to their participants, and then they would just score them and just note appropriate behavior, but didn't seem like they gave them a lot of feedback. They just would watch the video and score them. They also would then have a condition where they did verbal feedback or video feedback and concurrent job coach and self-evaluation. So the Jack or John would also fill out the BOSS at the same time. Though again, they made no mention whether the individual got feedback. They just watched a video of them working and filled out some forms. Oddly enough, well, I don't know if oddly enough, because the results I don't think were that strong. They, saw whatever growth was made, seemed to maintain or improve a year later when they sort of looked at those same skills. What were those results? Well, the most interesting one was that Jack on baseline engaged for like an average of about almost 4 minutes out of a 15-minute video with the task given. But after the first intervention, so just sitting next to the job coach while you watch the video together and you get scored and then don't necessarily see the results, did see an increase in like an average of almost 14 minutes on task, which maintained after a year. A lot of the other skills, though, like appropriate decisions, appropriate responding to others, really hygiene, really didn't change very much from before and after the intervention. And they were kind of already at a ceiling rate already. John, again, pretty similar results for active engagement being somewhat low and then increasing after that first intervention. And then the other skills were all somewhat high, although there was some decrease in a few of the skills after, he was asked to fill out the BOSS himself. I kind of felt like a lot of times intervention 2 didn't really have any impact whatsoever. Maybe it decreased the, responses a little bit.
Does not look to be much differentiation on the graph.
No. And that was one of the other challenges is they give these averages and you might see an increase in the average, but they were only looking at 15 minutes and a 1-minute partial interval. So there was just so much variability at times. And that makes sense. But I think one of the issues that comes in with partial interval is just it's such an overestimate. If I'm looking at graphs and I'm seeing that variability, that would kind of concern me. So if you're just saying, well, average wise, this is pretty good, that does mean that a large portion of the time, things might not be going that well. And it doesn't really capture like, well, how well do they have to go for the individual to be considered to be, performing up to the standards required by the employer? So I don't know if partial interval really captures that very well in general. Yeah. Plus, so many of the skills already were high and then kind of remained high. And then the few that were a little bit low, there was still so much variability that it didn't really feel like any of the interventions were that effective when I look at the graphs. Also, they mentioned this is a multiple probe design, but it didn't feel like they broke out the skills into what I would think of as a multiple probe. They sort of just ran the different interventions.
It looks like an A, B, C, D intervention.
Exactly, right? So I don't really see,
which is not
I don't
ideal.
see,
And the number of sessions is not staggered across participants either, because it could have been a multiple baseline across participants, but it looks to me like they have the same number of sessions in baseline.
Yeah. So I didn't really see where the experimental control was on these results that also weren't really jumping out at me as that amazing. They did mention both boys really loved looking at the camera. So I'm wondering how much of this was just reactivity with having a camera present. And they'd make statements like, they'd smile. They also might have been reactive to the fact that Mike, I think was one of their job coaches, would write things about them. And they'd say things like, Mike, you looked upset when I threw down my cloth. Were you upset at me, Mike? So I'm wondering, was there some sort of negative reinforcement to Mike's poor boss ratings, or Mike made a face? What else were people doing that might have given them the impression oh, I did something wrong. I better change what I'm engaged in. Mm-hmm. So, while this is an example of video modeling and it maybe had some
Sounds like
effectiveness.
self-monitoring.
Yeah, it may be, but the individuals barely monitored themselves. And the point where they actually did monitor themselves or score themselves actually would sometimes have worse results or no change at all. So if it was self-monitoring, it wasn't really effective self-monitoring. And if it wasn't self-monitoring, I'm not really sure what it was. Just sort of watching videos of oneself. I mean, perhaps that in itself, made a change, or when the camera was present, they were interested in engaging in some more appropriate behaviors, or maybe the data collection really just doesn't capture exactly what was happening. It's sort of my sense as well, just from looking at those graphs, but who knows?
This is, making me realize that in my study, they didn't talk about self-monitoring as a potential intervention, which is kind of interesting.
Mine didn't either.
Yeah. Like an area of research.
There you go. But
sounds like we're here.
Yeah, but in any case, yay, we're here in Dissemination Station. I just want to say, in any case, at least they used a lot of different job sites.
Oh, time's up.
All right, fine. All right, so when it comes to it, I don't know if we necessarily have any one big take-home point, because we did talk about a lot of areas of the vocational training. We talked about barriers. We talked about barriers. We talked about general practices that are going to be effective in terms of training job skills. We talked about some ideas for training, gaining of job skills. And we sort of broke down, one example of kind of what, one of these smaller studies might look like, though not necessarily one of the strongest ones. So I guess what might be best is for us to discuss one area that we would like to see more research done, or we ourselves would like to try putting into practice in the near future.
I really would like to see the effect of training interviewers on neurodivergent practices and and behaviors that may not matter in the interview, and see if that increases the acceptability of interviews, right? And see if more people get jobs, right? If you give that training to a company or the interviewer, right? Like, eye contact doesn't matter, right? Talk about the rationale why eye contact doesn't matter, right? Or talk about, right, like, I don't have to shake your hand and say, "How are you doing today, Bob?" Right? To be friendly or to do my job well.
I think I'd want to go even bigger and say, what are the most relevant skills that you should be paying attention to
Well, it's going to be different.
A job.
It should be the actual job. I think that people should go try to do the job, and if they can do it, great. Right? But I think that if we take a different spin and train everybody else on being more empathetic and not,
I'm sure you
so
could
much
find
weight.
jobs that were interested in increasing the diversity of their workforce, that would be interested in learning more about what factors may or may not be relevant to the jobs they're looking for. Or you may find that there are some jobs that it is, and other jobs it totally isn't relevant.
But if it isn't relevant, how can we then promote that in the job interview as well as keeping the job, right? In the culture of the workplace itself. That's what I want.
I think we had a hard time pinning down what we wanted to discuss in this topic.
So many months.
Because it's such a huge topic, right? So there's what does the landscape look like currently for employment for individuals with disabilities?
Bad.
And what does it look like as far as preparation for individuals to participate in the job setting?
Expensive.
And bad. And what do we know about how to teach people how to actually perform well in a job?
We don't know a lot.
We don't know a lot. And what is the bigger picture with respect to our society's view on inclusion of individuals with disabilities into the workspace? Also bad, right? So all of these areas have been really, grossly neglected, I think, from every point that you can turn to. And that's why it feels like such a huge topic, because there's so much work in this area that needs to be done. And it needs to be done not because we're trying to say, everyone has to contribute to society and be meaningful employed in order to have worth in society. That's not the point here. But the point is that we are missing out on improving people's lives and presenting them with the opportunities to feel included and, proud of what they have to contribute or the ways in which they spend their time. And without having that opportunity, then we're neglecting, seeing them feeling fulfilled. And I don't know what to say as far as where to start, because to me it feels like a huge area.
I'd definitely like to see more work in the job carving and sort of choice making of the individuals with disabilities themselves to try to see, can we get more matches? And with that, can we use the technologies that we know to be effective in teaching a variety of skills to teach the skills, and then look at how does that impact the ability to get and maintain a job? I'd also love to see more thorough planning for individuals in schools for what employment and life after school will look like. I mean, I think that is a big priority in a lot of areas. Certainly in US law has been more updated. But again, what does that planning look like? It looks so different depending on the area. You know, I've seen programs where they have like very robust vocational job placement components and training and feedback. I've seen ones where it just feels like, oh, we've got to pass the state academic test. And once that's done, then we'll start working on those job skills, you know, when you've got maybe a year or two before it's time to actually get a job, or possibly even less time. So I'd really like to see that connection explored more as well.
We did it.
Yeah, so that is a very, very broad review of some of the pieces that are going to go into vocational planning and training. And I think this is a topic, like we said, we have a lot of other articles, so we'll be coming back to this one a few times in the near future. All right. Well,
Great job, Rob.
Oh, thank you. Great job to you as well.
Thank you. Great job, Jackie.
You too.
Mutual Admiration Society over here. Well, there's one job that I know how to do because I have a task list, and that's ending a podcast. And that's what I'm going to do right now. We want to thank all of you so much for listening. We would love it if you subscribed to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Stitcher. Maybe even left us a review, some kind words, or feedback. It's certainly all good. We appreciate it all. If you'd like to reach out in some other ways, well, you can certainly find us on social media as ABA Inside Track. You can find these episodes posted on our YouTube page with the YouTube subtitling feature enabled. And you can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to get access to all of the articles, well, links to all of the articles that we discussed in this episode, as well as links to all of our previous episodes and to purchase CEs. If you want even more ABA Inside Track content, why not subscribe and join us over on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for just $5 a month, you can get early access to all these episodes, as well as discounts at the CE store and access to other bonus features like voting on one of our upcoming live episodes, and then getting some of our other kind of special videos we do. If you want more podcasts from us, well, at the premium $10 level, you'll gain access to all of our extra long book club podcasts, which are worth 2 CEs at no additional charge. We just finished our book club on the memoir Look Me in the Eye, which goes over a topic that Jackie brought up a lot on this episode, as well as all of our other book clubs from the past year and a half. Again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. And speaking of code words and CEs, why don't I give everyone the second code word? It is picnic. PICNIC. Like a picnic basket. You know, Yogi Bear. Remember Yogi Bear, everybody?
Yeah.
Hey, boo-boo.
There you go. He always wants a picnic basket. Picnic. All right. And that brings us to the end of the episode. Thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, to Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for all of his great editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.